James Crawford stood in the expansive glass-walled office of Crawford Innovations, the pinnacle of his life's work. From the 40th floor, the San Francisco skyline spread out before him in a panoramic sweep of high-rises and shimmering bay waters. The city pulsed with a relentless energy, a hum that once invigorated him but now felt strangely hollow. Behind him, sleek furniture and awards from prestigious tech summits lined the room, tangible proof of a success that should have made him feel invincible. But the gnawing sense of emptiness had been with him for years. James adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a nervous habit he hadn't kicked, as if the motion could somehow shift the unease. The day's board meeting had ended minutes ago. It had been yet another success, one more deal closed, another advancement in the company's cutting-edge AI. His team had erupted in applause as he sealed the presentation with his confident smile and firm handshake. Yet, while the accolades rolled in, James's mind was a million miles away. The day before, an encounter at the airport had shattered the routine of his carefully orchestrated life. He'd been on his way to a meeting in New York, standing in the VIP lounge surrounded by executives in tailored suits and the scent of expensive cologne. Just as he was reviewing last-minute notes, he caught sight of a woman through the glass partitions. Her hair, once a deep chestnut brown, now carried streaks of silver that only enhanced her elegance. Emily, the woman he'd loved and left, standing only a few dozen feet away, holding the hand of a young boy whose profile James recognized in an instant. His breath caught in his throat. It was like staring into a living mirror of his younger self. The boy, about 10 years old, had an effortless charm in the way he laughed and gestured as he spoke to Emily. James felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him unmoored. The memory of that night, Emily's tear-streaked face, the rain drumming on the window as he stormed out without looking back, rushed back like a tide. She had been holding her stomach, her voice cracking as she shared the news he wasn't ready to hear. She was pregnant, but James, consumed by the demands of his burgeoning empire and terrified of anything that might strip him of control, had accused her of trying to trap him. The words felt like venom even as he spat them out, and her sobs had chased him as he left, ringing in his ears for months after. "Sir?" The soft, practiced voice of Margaret, his assistant, cut through his thoughts. She stood at the doorway, holding a thick cream envelope, her expression unreadable. James blinked, taking a moment to ground himself before motioning for her to enter. The logo of the airport was faintly visible on the envelope, but the handwriting, a neat, looping script he hadn't seen in over a decade, was unmistakable. "Emily's. Leave it here," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Margaret placed it on his desk and retreated, leaving him alone with the past. His fingers grazed the edges of the envelope before he tore it open, the anticipation twisting his insides. "James, I didn't expect to see you yesterday. There's so much that has remained unspoken, buried under time and hurt. If you want to understand what happened, come to Bayshore Park at 4 p.m. tomorrow. I won't wait. Emily." The clock on his desk read 1:45 p.m. Bayshore Park was less than 30 minutes away, but the journey it symbolized was longer than anything he'd taken in years. He folded the letter and sat back, the weight of regret pressing down on him. 10 years. A decade of empty victories, of superficial relationships, and silent dinners in a house that echoed with the absence of laughter. Outside, clouds began to gather, casting moving shadows across the office. James knew that showing up would mean facing every selfish decision, every moment of pride that kept him from admitting he was wrong. But it would also be a step toward redemption, a chance to understand the boy whose existence he had denied and the woman he had left in the wake of his ambition. For the first time in years, James felt the embers of hope spark to life. James felt a tension thrumming through his veins as he walked into Bayshore Park. The late afternoon sun, hidden behind thick, gray clouds, cast a muted light over the landscape. He scanned the open field, the neatly trimmed hedges, and the paths winding through beds of colorful flowers. There was an unusual stillness in the park, as if it, too, were holding its breath for what was to come. His polished shoes crunched on the gravel path as he approached the heart of the park. Memories flooded him. long-forgotten afternoons spent here with Emily during the early days, picnics on lazy Sundays, moments when work hadn't been an all-consuming beast. Those memories were tarnished now, stained by the years that had passed and the choices he had made. A bench near the fountain came into view, and James's heart stuttered. There she was. Emily sat with her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap, gazing at the water. The boy, Lucas, stood a few feet away, tossing pebbles and watching the ripples spread across the surface. Even from a distance, James could see the determination in his posture, the quick flick of his hand that mirrored his own childhood habits. James hesitated. The man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multimillion-dollar deals now felt paralyzed by the simple act of walking up to his past. But then Emily turned, her eyes meeting his, and there was no going back. The surprise on her face softened into something unreadable, and she nodded once, acknowledging his presence. "James," she said, her voice low and guarded as he approached. There was no warmth, no welcome, just a neutral acknowledgement that made his stomach tighten. "Emily," he responded, barely able to keep the tremor from his voice. He glanced at Lucas, who had now noticed the new arrival and was studying him with a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. The boy's dark eyes, his eyes, were filled with questions he was too young to ask aloud. "I didn't know you were back in California," Emily said, breaking the silence. Her tone was steady, but the slight edge betrayed her unease. She looked stronger than he remembered, her shoulders squared, her gaze unwavering. This was a woman who had learned to stand on her own, who had found strength in absence. "I didn't expect to be," James admitted, the words feeling heavy in the air between them. He looked at Lucas again, who shifted his weight, waiting for an introduction that never came. "I saw you at the airport yesterday. I couldn't just walk away." Emily nodded, a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps, crossing her face. "I thought as much," she said softly. She turned to Lucas, her expression shifting to one of gentleness. "Lucas, this is James Crawford, an old friend." The label stung. Old friend. But James couldn't blame her. It was simpler than saying what they both knew to be true. Lucas stepped closer, his expression wary but intrigued. "Hello," Lucas said, his voice clear, carrying none of the tension that hung between the adults. "Hi, Lucas," James replied, his heart thudding in his chest. The boy was close now, close enough for James to see the faint freckle under his left eye, a mirror image of his own. James wanted to reach out, to touch the shoulder of this boy who was half him, but he stayed rooted, unsure if he even had the right. Emily rose, her movements graceful yet deliberate. "Why don't we walk?" she suggested, breaking the stillness. Without waiting for a response, she turned and started down the path, Lucas trotting ahead, unaware of the emotional battle that raged behind him. James fell into step beside Emily, the silence stretching until it felt suffocating. He struggled to find the words that had eluded him for a decade. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, so low he wasn't sure she'd heard. She did. Her stride faltered for a heartbeat before she resumed, eyes fixed forward. "A lot has happened, James. Apologies don't change the past." "I know," he said, voice stronger this time, "but it's a start." They walked in silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound for a moment. Lucas had stopped by a tree and was examining a small caterpillar crawling along a branch, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind him. Emily sighed, her expression softening as she watched Lucas. "He's a good boy. Smart, curious. He plays the violin, you know?" James felt a pang in his chest, the echoes of what could have been swirled around him. "I didn't know." "I didn't think you would," Emily said, her voice tinged with something between sadness and resolve. She turned to face him, eyes sharp. "He doesn't know about you. Not the truth, at least." James's throat tightened, the weight of years pressing down. "Emily, I know I failed you. I failed both of you. But if you give me a chance, I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I'll try." The tension crackled between them, and for the first time, James saw tears brimming in Emily's eyes. But they didn't fall. She blinked them away and took a deep breath, her expression softening as she looked at Lucas. "You have no idea what trying looks like, James," she said, the words cutting deeper than any reprimand. James nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of his fight to be part of their lives. And as he watched Lucas laugh at the caterpillar and run back toward them, the realization hit him like a wave. This was the most important battle he would ever fight. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the park. The light filtered through the leaves, dappling the path with moving patches of brightness. Lucas ran up to them, eyes sparkling with the untainted joy of a child. "Mom, look at this." He held out the small caterpillar, cradling it delicately in his palm. Emily's face softened as she leaned down to inspect the tiny creature, her hair falling forward to frame her face. James took a step closer, marveling at the scene. It was such a simple moment, yet it spoke of everything he'd missed: the wonder, the little discoveries that made up a childhood. "It's wonderful, Lucas," Emily said with a warm smile, one that reminded James of their early days. The expression faded when her eyes flicked back to him, but the brief glimpse had been enough to stir something long buried. Lucas turned to James, curiosity lighting up his features. "Do you like caterpillars?" he asked, holding out his hand for James to see. The question, so innocent and unexpected, made James's throat tighten. He glanced at Emily, who was watching intently, her guard up. "I do," James said, his voice steadying. "They remind me that change is possible, even when it doesn't seem like it." The words carried more weight than Lucas could understand, but Emily's eyes widened, catching the double meaning. Lucas beamed and looked at the caterpillar in awe, as if he had just heard a great secret. "Maybe this one will be a butterfly soon." "Maybe," James agreed, unable to tear his eyes from the boy. The boy who was his son, who shared his blood and perhaps more than just his eyes. For a moment, a fragile silence enveloped them, broken only by the rustle of leaves and distant laughter of other children playing in the park. Emily stood, brushing her hands against her jeans. "It's getting late. We should head home, Lucas." The boy's face fell slightly. "Can Mr. Crawford come with us? He hasn't finished telling me about caterpillars." The innocent question cut through the remaining barriers, drawing a sharp intake of breath from Emily. James met Emily's eyes, searching for any sign of hope or forgiveness. Her jaw tightened, and she glanced down at Lucas, then back at James. There was a silent conversation, one built on years of history and the present weight of unspoken words. Finally, she nodded, a small, tentative gesture. "All right, but just for a little while," Emily said, her voice quiet. Lucas whooped in excitement, and James felt his heart race with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, relief, fear of what this moment could mean. They walked together, Lucas skipping ahead on the path that led out of the park. The streets of the small coastal town, just an hour's drive from the city, were quiet at this time of the evening. James's eyes roamed the familiar storefronts and cafes, taking in the changes. The town had a slower rhythm than San Francisco, one that soothed and unnerved him in equal measure. Emily's house was small but charming, painted in soft blues with flower boxes under the windows brimming with colorful blooms. Lucas ran ahead, letting himself in and disappearing into the hallway with a shout of, "I'm getting my violin." Emily stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes scanning James's face as if trying to read his intentions. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, the silence stretching once more. "Why now, James?" she asked, her tone weary but sincere. "Why come back after all this time?" James took a deep breath, the scent of sea air filling his lungs. "Because I saw what I was missing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Because I realized I lost more than just you and Lucas. I lost myself." Emily's eyes softened, but the steel in her voice remained. "It's not as simple as just showing up and saying the right things. You left, and we rebuilt our lives. I had to." Lucas had to grow up not knowing why his father didn't want him. The words struck like blows, and James closed his eyes briefly against the shame. "I know, and I can't change that. But I'm here now, and I want to be a part of his life, if you'll let me." Before Emily could respond, Lucas came rushing back, violin in hand and eyes bright. "Mom, can I play the new piece I learned?" Emily's gaze lingered on James for a moment before she nodded at Lucas, a small, reluctant smile breaking through. "Of course, sweetheart." Lucas positioned himself in the living room, bow poised over the strings. The first notes were tentative, but soon a melody filled the room, clear, strong, and filled with hope. James felt his chest tighten, the music reaching places he thought he'd shut away. He watched as Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them. As the song ended, the last note lingered in the air, leaving a silence that was heavy yet filled with possibility. James's voice came out barely above a whisper. "That was beautiful, Lucas." Lucas grinned, unaware of the significance his music had brought to the room. "Thanks. I'm going to practice more for the school concert next week." James glanced at Emily, who met his eyes for a moment, the barriers between them just a little weaker than before. "Maybe I could come to watch," he said, the question hanging delicately in the air. Emily looked down, taking a deep breath before nodding slowly. "Maybe," she said, a single word that was a small, precious step toward rebuilding what had been broken. As the evening deepened, the warm light of the sun gave way to the cool embrace of twilight. Emily moved into the kitchen, setting a pot of water to boil for tea. The sounds of Lucas's footsteps, punctuated by his humming, filled the house with an energy that James had only imagined from a distance. He stood by the living room window, hands in his pockets, observing the familiar yet foreign space where memories of their shared past mingled with years he'd missed. Emily's house was filled with small, personal touches, a framed drawing Lucas had made, a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, books stacked on the coffee table. It was cozy and lived in, a far cry from James's sterile, modern penthouse that felt more like a showroom than a home. "Tea." Emily's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She stood at the doorway of the kitchen, holding two mismatched cups, a tentative offering. James nodded and took the cup she handed him, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he saw the way Emily's expression flickered, betraying a trace of the past that still lingered between them. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. They sat opposite each other at the small dining table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Lucas appeared in the doorway, his violin still in hand. "Can I play outside for a bit, Mom?" His eyes darted between them, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Emily nodded. "Stay close to the house," she said, her voice steady. Lucas smiled and bolted out the door, the screen door slamming behind him with a sharp clatter. James took a sip of the hot tea, letting the warmth steady him. He looked up to find Emily watching him with an expression that was unreadable, yet patient, as if waiting for him to speak. "It's strange," he began, his eyes meeting hers, "being here. It feels familiar, yet I know how much has changed." Emily exhaled, the sound carrying years of exhaustion. "Everything has changed, James. You don't just walk back into our lives and pick up where you left off." Her words were sharp but not unkind. There was no malice in her tone, only the firm honesty of someone who had lived through the aftermath of abandonment. "I know," James admitted, setting his cup down, "and I don't expect things to go back to what they were. I don't deserve that. But I'm hoping there's a way forward, for Lucas's sake, if not for mine." A shadow crossed Emily's face, and she looked down at her hands, twisting the ring she still wore on her right hand. A simple silver band James remembered giving her on their first anniversary. "Lucas deserves the truth. For years, I tried to protect him from the pain of knowing that his father chose work over family. But now he deserves to know who you really are, not just the man in the stories I told him when he was too young to ask questions." The weight of her words hung between them, pressing on James like a boulder. "I want to be honest with him," he said after a moment, "but I don't want to hurt him, Emily. I've already done enough of that without even being here." Emily's eyes softened, her defenses slipping just a bit. "The truth will hurt, but it's necessary. He's stronger than you think." He had to be. Her voice wavered, and she blinked quickly, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. The silence that followed was interrupted by the sound of Lucas's violin, now drifting through the open window. He was playing a simple tune, one that James recognized from his own childhood. The notes, tentative at first, grew steadier as he found his rhythm. It was a song James's mother had sung to him when he was a boy, one that spoke of resilience and hope. The unexpected memory gripped his heart, and for a moment, the distance between the man he had become and the child he once was seemed to narrow. "Did you teach him that song?" James asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emily shook her head, a small, bittersweet smile playing at her lips. "No, he found it in an old music book I had. He said he liked it, that it made him feel safe." James closed his eyes, feeling the years fold in on themselves. How many nights had he spent listening to that same melody, thinking it was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay? The realization that Lucas had gravitated to it on his own, that they shared something so intrinsic, stirred something deep within him. "Emily, I don't know how to make up for all the lost time," he said, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. If that means starting from scratch, earning your trust, being there for Lucas, I'm here." Emily's eyes shimmered with tears she finally let fall, and she looked out the window at Lucas, who was still lost in his music. "It's not going to be easy, James. There are no guarantees." "I know," he whispered, the gravity of her words anchoring him to this moment. "But I'm ready to try, for him and for you, if you'll let me." She studied him for a long moment, the air between them charged with everything they'd been through and everything they might still face. Finally, she nodded, a small, cautious motion. "We'll start with the truth, James. For Lucas's sake." Outside, Lucas played on, the simple tune carrying into the night, weaving hope into the spaces where it had been absent for far too long. The days that followed their tense encounter at Bayshore Park were marked by quiet, cautious steps forward. James visited regularly, always under Emily's watchful eye. Each visit brought moments of tentative connection, though the shadows of the past loomed heavily. Lucas, unaware of the gravity behind the sudden presence of this new old friend, delighted in having someone to share his stories and violin practices with. James listened intently, savoring every note and every laugh that filled the house. One afternoon, Emily invited James for dinner. The invitation had come with a firm warning in her eyes, but it was an invitation nonetheless. James arrived on time, his heart hammering as he stood on the porch with a bouquet of daisies, Emily's favorite flowers. She accepted them with a fleeting, surprised smile before placing them in a vase. The dinner was simple: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Lucas chattered happily, recounting his day at school and how he was preparing for his upcoming concert. James responded with genuine interest, asking questions that made Lucas's eyes light up with excitement. But under the surface, tension bubbled, kept at bay by the rhythmic clink of forks against plates. After dinner, Lucas dashed to the living room to play with a puzzle, leaving James and Emily at the table. The silence between them felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter the careful progress they had made. Emily broke the silence, her voice low. "Lucas has been asking questions about you. He's starting to piece things together." James's fingers tightened around his water glass. "What has he asked?" "Why you're here now, why he hasn't met you before," she said, her eyes fixed on the table. "He's smart, James. He knows something's different." The weight of those unasked questions pressed down on James. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, words felt inadequate. "I think it's time we told him the truth." Emily looked up, searching his face for hesitation. Finding none, she nodded. "Tomorrow, after school." The agreement hung in the air, thick and heavy. It was a step into uncharted territory, and James felt both relief and dread at what it would mean for Lucas, for Emily, and for himself. The next day passed in a blur. James found himself pacing the small apartment he rented in the town, unable to focus on work or anything that would distract him from the impending conversation. When the time finally came, he made his way to Emily's house, the autumn wind biting through his coat as he walked up the path. Lucas bounded to the door, violin case still in hand, a smile lighting up his face when he saw James. "Hi, Mr. Crawford. Are you here to hear me practice again?" James's throat tightened. "Not today, Lucas. Today, we need to talk." Lucas's smile faltered, and he glanced back at Emily, who stood behind him with a reassuring nod. "Come sit with us," she said, leading the way to the living room. The cozy space seemed to shrink as they all settled in, James on the couch and Lucas between him and Emily. "Lucas," Emily began, her voice steady but tender, "there's something important we need to tell you." Lucas's eyes darted between them, wide with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. James took a deep breath. "Lucas, do you know why I've been spending more time here?" The boy shook his head slowly, confusion creasing his brow. "I thought you were Mom's friend from before," he said, glancing at Emily. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I am," James said, his voice softening. "But there's more to it. Lucas, I'm not just an old friend. I'm your father." The room went still. Lucas blinked, the words taking a moment to register. His small hands clenched the fabric of the couch as he processed the revelation. "My dad," he whispered, eyes filling with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. "Yes," James said, barely able to hold back the emotion in his voice. "I'm your dad. I wasn't here when you were younger, and that was my mistake. But I'm here now, and I want to be a part of your life if you'll let me." Lucas looked to Emily, searching her face for confirmation. She reached out and took his hand. "It's true, sweetheart. James is your father. I know this is a lot to take in." For a moment, Lucas was silent. Then, tears welled in his eyes, and he pushed himself off the couch, stepping back. "But why didn't you come before? Why now?" His voice trembled, and James felt each word cut into him like a knife. "I was afraid, Lucas," James admitted, rising slowly. "I made mistakes. I was selfish and focused on the wrong things. But I'm here now because I realized how much I've missed, how much I want to be part of your life." The room seemed to hold its breath. Lucas's eyes, so much like James's own, reflected hurt and confusion. He looked down, his small shoulders shaking. Emily moved to comfort him, but James held out a hand, a silent plea to let him try. "Lucas, I can't change the past," James said, his voice breaking. "But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to be here for you now, to make up for the time we lost." Lucas sniffed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He glanced at Emily, who nodded encouragingly, then back at James. "Are you going to leave again?" he whispered. James felt the weight of a decade pressed down on him, but he met Lucas's gaze with unwavering sincerity. "No, Lucas. I'm here to stay, if you'll have me." A silence followed that seemed to stretch forever. Then, slowly, Lucas took a tentative step forward and wrapped his arms around James's waist. James's breath caught, and he knelt down, hugging the boy tightly as tears slipped down his cheeks. Emily watched, her eyes shining as a tear finally fell. The room, once heavy with uncertainty, now held a fragile hope that shimmered like the last light of day. The days following Lucas's discovery were an emotional whirlwind. The boy's initial excitement at having a father gave way to moments of silence and uncertainty, where questions lingered just beneath the surface. James and Emily navigated the delicate new reality carefully, balancing Lucas's curiosity with the unspoken tension between them. James's visits became more frequent, and soon they fell into a new routine. He would come by after work, helping Lucas with his violin practice or sitting with him as he worked on school assignments. The house was no longer a stranger's territory, but a place where James found himself drawn more and more, not just because of Lucas, but because of the fleeting smiles Emily allowed herself to share. One evening, Lucas bounded up to James, eyes bright with excitement. "Dad, there's a father-son day at school next week. Will you come with me?" The word "dad" still sent a jolt through James, the sound both foreign and wonderful. He glanced at Emily, who had paused mid-slice of the apple she was preparing, eyes locked on him. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of hope and caution. James turned back to Lucas, his heart swelling with determination. "Of course, Lucas. I wouldn't miss it for anything." The boy's smile lit up the room, and he dashed off, already chattering about the event. Emily resumed slicing the apple, the knife moving slowly as she spoke. "Are you sure you're ready for that? It's a lot to take on." James stepped closer, his voice steady. "I know, but I'm ready. I have to be." She set down the knife and looked at him, the guarded expression slipping for a moment. For his sake, I hope so. The morning of the father-son event dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that seemed full of promise. James arrived at the small school, his heart thundering with anticipation. Lucas greeted him at the entrance, practically bouncing with excitement. The sight of his son's enthusiasm washed over James like a balm, easing the tension coiled in his chest. "Come on, Dad. We're going to start with the games first." Lucas grabbed his hand, leading him into a gymnasium decorated with banners and streamers. Other fathers and their sons milled about, laughter and chatter filling the space. James felt a wave of nervousness as eyes turned to him, some curious, others recognizing him as the successful tech mogul from the city. But none of that mattered when Lucas beamed up at him, his trust and pride clear. The games were simple but competitive: three-legged races, relay challenges, and a tug-of-war that left everyone breathless and laughing. For James, the moments blurred into one another, each second a snapshot of joy and rediscovery. Lucas's laughter was infectious, a sound James realized he had craved for longer than he could remember. After the activities, the school organized a lunch in the outdoor courtyard. James sat next to Lucas, a paper plate balanced on his lap, while the boy regaled him with stories about his friends and school adventures. For the first time in years, James felt like he belonged somewhere beyond the sterile boardrooms and the echo of lonely dinners in his penthouse. "Mr. Crawford?" A soft voice interrupted the moment. James looked up to see another father, a man with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I just wanted to say it's nice seeing you here. Lucas talks about you a lot." James's chest tightened, the compliment both painful and comforting. "Thank you. It's good to be here." The man nodded and turned away, leaving James with the realization of how much he'd missed, but also with the hope of being more present moving forward. Lucas's hand slipped into his, small and trusting, anchoring him to this new beginning. When the day wound down, Lucas clung to James as if not wanting the day to end. "Did you have fun, Dad?" he asked, eyes wide and hopeful. James's throat tightened, and he forced himself to speak around the lump that had formed. "I had the best day, Lucas. Thank you for asking me to come." Lucas hugged him tightly, and James felt the walls he'd built around his heart crack just a little more. Over the boy's shoulder, James's eyes met Emily's across the courtyard. She was watching them, a soft, almost wistful smile on her lips. In that moment, James felt a silent understanding pass between them, a recognition that this was a step in the right direction. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, James lingered at the door, hesitant to leave. Emily stood in the living room, arms crossed but not in the defensive way he'd grown used to. There was something open in her stance, something that invited conversation. "You did well today," she said, breaking the silence. "Lucas hasn't stopped talking about how much fun he had." James nodded, his voice low. "I'm glad. It felt right being there with him." He paused, searching her eyes. "I want more of that, Emily. For him, but also for us. I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to be part of your lives in more than just fleeting visits." She looked away, the room settling into a quiet that was both familiar and strained. When she finally spoke, her words were careful. "It's not just about showing up, James. It's about consistency, proving that you're here for the long haul." "I know," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time in years, James saw something there that looked like hope. It was fragile, barely formed, but it was enough. "Then we'll see," she said softly. "We'll take it one day at a time." The night stretched before them, full of uncharted possibilities, as James left with the smallest, but most significant, piece of progress: a chance. The following weeks were a test of resilience and patience. James learned that rebuilding a relationship with Emily and Lucas was more than shared dinners and laughter. It was showing up even on days when doubt gnawed at him. It was apologizing when old wounds surfaced unexpectedly, staying when conversations turned difficult, and listening, truly listening, to both of them. Lucas's school concert was fast approaching, and it had become the focus of his evenings. James spent hours sitting with him as he practiced, offering encouragement and watching the boys' skills flourish. One evening, after Lucas finished playing a particularly tricky piece, he looked up at James with a proud smile. "Dad, do you think I'll do okay at the concert?" Lucas's voice was small, betraying the nerves he'd been trying to hide. James smiled, his heart swelling with both love and admiration. "I think you'll do better than okay. I think you'll be amazing." Lucas beamed, and Emily, who had been listening from the kitchen, caught James's eye. Her expression was soft, the guarded walls between them lowering ever so slightly. The night of the concert arrived, and the school's small auditorium was packed with parents, siblings, and teachers. The buzz of excitement and nervous chatter filled the room as people settled into their seats. James sat next to Emily, an odd mix of nervousness and pride bubbling inside him. This was his first time at one of Lucas's milestones, and he was determined not to miss a second. The lights dimmed, and the principal stepped onto the stage, welcoming everyone. When it was Lucas's turn to perform, James felt his chest tighten. The boy walked onto the stage, violin in hand, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Lucas gave a small, brave smile, and James nodded, his own smile reassuring. The first notes were hesitant, but as Lucas played, he found his rhythm, and the music filled the room. It was beautiful and haunting, the kind of melody that seeped into the heart. James could feel the emotion in every note, the way Lucas poured himself into the performance. It was more than just a concert. It was Lucas's way of sharing a piece of himself with the world, and James realized with a bittersweet ache that he was witnessing his son's courage firsthand. When the last note lingered and faded, the audience erupted into applause. James's hands stung as he clapped, pride and tears blurring his vision. Emily clapped too, her eyes shimmering as she turned to James, their shared pride unspoken but deeply understood. Lucas bounded off the stage and straight into their arms. "Did you like it?" he asked breathlessly, eyes darting between James and Emily. "It was perfect, Lucas," Emily said, kissing his forehead. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice full of emotion. "You were incredible, son." Lucas's smile was so wide it crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm glad you were both here." The car ride home was filled with chatter as Lucas replayed the night, recounting every detail as if they hadn't just experienced it moments before. When they reached Emily's house, Lucas ran inside to hang up his concert attire and grab a late-night snack. James and Emily lingered on the porch, the crisp night air carrying the scent of salt from the nearby ocean. "He's grown so much," James said, breaking the comfortable silence. His gaze followed the path Lucas had just taken, the warmth of the evening still echoing in his chest. "He has," Emily replied, a soft smile on her lips. She looked at James, her expression contemplative. "You've changed too, James. More than I thought you could." James met her eyes, the weight of her words settling into his bones. "I had to, Emily. I couldn't keep living the way I was, empty, pretending I didn't care. You and Lucas, you made me realize what I was missing, what really matters." She turned her gaze to the dark sky, stars flickering like tiny hopes above them. "I used to dream of this, you know? You being here, being a father to Lucas, sharing moments like tonight. But it always felt impossible." James took a step closer, the vulnerability in his voice evident. "It was impossible because I was too blind to see what I was throwing away. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. If it takes a lifetime to prove that, I will." Emily's eyes searched his face, and he could see the battle inside her. The desire to believe, to let go of the pain that had kept her guarded for so long. After what felt like an eternity, she exhaled, the sound carrying both relief and uncertainty. "Forgiveness isn't instant, James," she said quietly, "but I think I'm ready to try." The words hung between them, delicate and fragile, yet filled with a tentative hope. James felt a warmth spread through him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the family he had lost. Lucas's laughter drifted out from the house, a sound that wrapped around them like a promise. Emily smiled, a genuine one that lit up her eyes, and nodded toward the door. "Come inside, James. It's getting cold." James followed her into the house, the threshold no longer a barrier but a bridge to a future he was determined to build. The soft glow of the living room light spilled into the hallway, casting away the shadows that had once haunted him. For the first time in over a decade, James felt like he was home. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, James found himself woven deeper into the fabric of Lucas's life. Mornings began with the scent of coffee and the soft rustling of pages as James read the newspaper at the kitchen table while Lucas devoured his cereal and rattled off his plans for the day. Evenings were a mixture of laughter, violin practice, and the quiet companionship of shared moments. The house, once a symbol of what he had missed, became a place where James could feel the pulse of something he thought he had lost forever: family. One Saturday, as the town bustled with its usual weekend energy, Lucas approached James with a nervous smile and a slip of paper in hand. "Dad, I signed up for a father-son hike next weekend. It's a fundraiser for the school. Would you come with me?" James looked at the paper, the event details scrawled in Lucas's eager handwriting. It was a simple request, but the word "Dad" still tugged at something deep within him. "I'd love to, Lucas," James said, pulling his son into a hug. Lucas's face lit up, and he raced off to tell Emily, who was in the garden tending to her flowers. Emily glanced over her shoulder as Lucas relayed the news, her eyes meeting James's with a look that spoke of quiet acceptance and growing trust. The weeks had softened the sharp edges between them. Their conversations, once laced with hesitation and old wounds, now held an ease that hinted at forgiveness. The day of the hike arrived, and James and Lucas stood at the edge of a trail that cut through the dense woods on the outskirts of town. Other fathers and sons gathered around, laughter and shouts mingling with the rustle of leaves. James felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Emily, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good luck," she said. Her voice held a note of warmth that James had yearned to hear for years. He smiled back, the gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thanks. We'll need it," he joked, ruffling Lucas's hair. Lucas laughed and pulled James toward the starting point, the two of them joining the other pairs as the whistle blew. The trail wound through the forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The air was filled with the chatter of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Lucas talked animatedly, pointing out plants and listening to James's stories about the hikes he used to take as a boy. There was a joy in his son's laughter, a freedom that James hadn't witnessed before. As they reached the halfway point, a clearing with a view of the valley below, Lucas paused, looking out at the expanse of trees and sky. He turned to James, eyes serious. "Dad, do you think things will always be like this?" James knelt down to be at eye level with him, the wind ruffling their hair. "I hope so, Lucas, and I'll do everything I can to make sure it stays this way." Lucas nodded, seeming to take the words to heart. He wrapped his arms around James in a spontaneous hug, holding on tight. James closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the embrace a reminder of how far they had come. They finished the hike hand in hand, laughter spilling out as they returned to the starting point. Emily was waiting at the end, her face lighting up as she saw them approach. James caught her eye, and she mouthed the words, "Well done." He smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and hope. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of oranges and purples, James sat on the porch with Emily, a comfortable silence between them. Lucas's laughter echoed from inside the house as he recounted the day's events to his friends over the phone. The glow of the porch light cast soft shadows, and James felt the weight of the past ease under the warmth of the present. "I never thought I'd see this day," Emily said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost contemplative. James turned to her, the emotion raw in his voice. "Neither did I, but I'm grateful. For you, for Lucas, for the chance to make things right." Emily met his gaze, and this time, there was no trace of the guarded expression that had once defined her. "We're all learning to forgive, James, one day at a time." He reached out, taking her hand gently. The touch was tentative but full of promise, a step towards something they had both thought lost. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand lightly, an unspoken agreement that the past no longer held them captive. As the night deepened and the stars came out, they sat side by side, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. Inside, Lucas's voice drifted through the open window, bright and full of life. James knew that the path ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but for the first time, he faced the future with hope. This was not just a return to the life he had once known. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written with love, forgiveness, and the promise of second chances. And as James looked out at the starlit sky, he knew one thing for certain. He was finally where he was meant to be. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing to the channel and support us through the thanks button. Until next time.